main goals regarding impact-oriented strategies. And we are validating this, interviewing managers currently in the last month. Hopefully I can add this before submitting to the symposium. Not sure if I'm able. And that's it. Basically, we consider the dual purpose as the ones that explicit that in their websites and so on.
And do we have any idea why the size of SIPs doesn't increase significantly in order to make it more interesting both for in terms of impact and financially? Why do they keep being so small?
Did you catch that, Fernando?
No, I didn't. Sorry, it's quite low.
Yeah, it's quite so. I think the question from Keys was if you got a sense of why the amounts are so small.
Okay, yeah, of course. The uncertainties behind the investment. So the social first, they are not that concerned with the financial return. So they are basically running pilots. And if that works, that's great. If that doesn't work, no big issue. But the financial first, if they are not too certain regarding what to expect, then they are running forever pilots, as we would say, and only scaling up when they are sure about the results.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fernando, and thank you, Keith, for the question. So I think we've got a few minutes left. There's a related question from Mathilde in the chat, which we can go to. Or if not, I'd also be quite interested in if anyone has any questions for Matti on the second paper, on the Finnish one. If not, I might jump in because I've got a question on that one. And Matti, I wonder, I really, as Claire was saying, though, it was interesting that we've got, both in the first two papers kind of seem to be challenging the NPM idea around SIBs. And I wonder if you could say a little bit, Matti, please, about why you feel that in the Finnish context, this challenges the new public management model, please.
Well, I think how SIPs have been introduced in Finland, that they've been originated by the Sitrasis think tank and then the government agency that's been kind of promoting SIPs and framed them in a certain way, and then started kind of promoting them towards the cities and municipalities and public organizations. So kind of the starting and they have supported, played quite a big role throughout the preparation of all the SIPs, and so they have had a lot of influence in framing what SIPs are in Finland and what kind, how they should be done. So I think just and I think that way it has taken a slightly different track than maybe they would have if the cities would have adopted them by themselves independently.
Thank you, Matti. Now, Fernando, you have your hand up. Do you want to jump back in?
Yeah, just to ask a question, may I?
Yes, of course.
So to Matti, like I was wondering a bit related to my research, but user implementation challenges, would they be similar to scaling up challenges in the sense that, for instance, finding indicators might not be a challenge for scaling because you know what are the indicators once you're scaling, but cooperation and institutional challenges might persist. And I was wondering about all these.
Yeah, I think there's we haven't that much experience in the scaling, but we've been thinking that about a lot. And we think, I think the question here is that there's lots of kind of the SIPs might be but really locally embedded to some extent. So the preparation and the indicators are suitable for specific purposes. But I think there's some kind of shared part of that you could that others could adopt to that are not too locally embedded. And so I think the scaling it's probably it's not as difficult as these forerunners in doing this the first time. And I think related to scaling, there's also the aim that once the municipalities go through this process. Then they learn themselves new ways of organizing public services, so that they can, and this knowledge they can use themselves in future SIPs or future outsourcing or in their internal service provision in future. So that kind of, you might have broader impact beyond this one project via this knowledge that is generated and the kind of learnings, tacit knowledge that accumulates in the organizations.
Brilliant, thank you, Matti. And I think we're on time, but I'll pass over to Claire now for the next stage. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for that. Really interesting to sort of hear some of the questions come through, and indeed many of the questions that I had in my own head. So great. We're going to move on to a sort of pairing of papers now. One of our presenters is not able to join us, so we'll be hearing from De Pieri, Chiodo, and Gerli about based on outcomes, the sort of challenges and missed opportunities of measuring outcomes, and then Anders and Dorset talking about their experience running evaluations on 2 large-scale PBR programs. I think there's an interesting pickup note here from the first set of papers, which is around the sort of nuance of indicator selection and evaluation. So with that, can I hand over to Chiodo, Gerli, and De Pieri?
Yeah, thank you, Claire. I'm going to present the paper, so I'm sharing the screen. Okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Veronica Chiodo. I'm a research assistant at the School of Management of Polytechnic of Milan. And I co-authored this paper with my colleague Benedetta De Pieri and Francesco Gerli, which is titled Based on Outcome Challenges and Missed Opportunity of Measuring Social Outcome in Outcome-Based Contracting. So basically, the paper stems from the idea that despite the huge promise surrounding social outcome contracting, we still have a lack of evidence about the effectiveness. And of course, this is related to how the measurement of social outcome is designed and implemented. So the paper wants to investigate how social outcome are measured in social outcome contracting, and in particular, focusing on the main challenges and opportunities. The literature has already identified, let's say, different steps in the design and implementation process of the measurement of social outcome measurements, which seems to be crucial and somehow problematic, which are the definition of the evaluation design, the identification, as Claire mentioned, of outcome metrics and targets, and some practical implication. And we specifically focus on these 3 topics in our paper. We use a qualitative methodology, and we explore 4 case studies of social outcome contracting in UK, applying then a thematic analysis to analyze the data. So in terms of fundings, as I mentioned, we deep dive in the 3 steps and in the 3 topics. As for the design of the measurement methodology, we found basically that in our case, no one used experimental or quasi-experimental methods to measure the outcomes related to payments. And this was related to many difficulties that we identify. And in addition, we found that in all cases, there is a lack of independence of the evaluation related to the payments. In terms of the definition of outcomes, the most interesting points emerged from the analysis was basically that we found a, let's say, strong misalignment of viewpoints in defining what should be measured and how to measure it between the commissioners and the service providers. And in all the cases, we detected basically perverse incentives related to the design of the metrics. A possible solution applied in the case that we analyzed was basically to set up eco-designing phases, as we already heard in the previous paper. The last, let's say, cluster was about practical implication. the most, let's say, the most common pattern coming from the data was basically that service providers were heavily involved in the data collection, and it was very perceived as a burden from them. And another problem was basically that they don't have the proper expertise to collect the data, and this led to a poor quality of data. Again, one of possible solutions suggested by a service provider involved was to set up a sort of ramp-up phase before, let's say, the measurings, the outcomes triggering the payments in order to test the measurement methodology and design. To conclude, from our analysis, I will say that the main points are basically that in all the cases that we analyze, the social outcomes related to payments are basically more tracked and measured, and so the causality between the results and the intervention was basically not proven. We found that in each case, many evaluations have been implemented, and so this suggests that the success of the schemes and of the intervention is actually not fully represented by the achievement of the target itself, but multiple evaluation allows to give a complete understanding. And what we refer in our title as the missed opportunity is basically the idea that we can, the use of these schemes can help to spread a measurement culture of social impact among the service providers and also the other stakeholders. But it was basically a missed opportunity because we didn't find significant example of collaborative approaches that were able to lead to these goals. So that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting to hear a bit more about the variation across some of the cases, and in particular that delineation between methods, indicators, and the kind of co-design process that you talked about as a mitigating strategy for some of those challenges that they encountered. Right, so relatedly then, we'll hand things over to Anders and Dorset to talk about their own experience doing some of these evaluations.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Is that visible?
We can see it. It is the full sort of PowerPoint screen as opposed to just the slide, but it is legible.
Better?
Now we see presentation, like presenter mode.
Okay. I really should have practiced this beforehand, shouldn't I?
Try display settings.
Screen one. I'm running a two-screen setup here, so that might be the. How's that?
It hasn't changed on my side. We can read the slide if you're not bothered by us potentially also seeing your notes. Ah, now it's updated and looks good.
Yeah, I don't think I have any notes.
Okay.
So good. Well, this is, I'm Richard Dorset from the University of Westminster, and this is joint with Anders from UCL. And really what the paper does is it just kind of develops and builds on some ideas that have emerged in the course of two evaluations that we worked on that both had a kind of payment by result component to them. So the first of these is the work programme. This was UK's main employment programme up until 2017. National programme, and it was delivered by providers who were paid according to how well they managed to get people into employment and into sustained employment. So these are primarily private sector providers. Now, usefully from our point of view, individuals within a local area or contract package area, as it was known, were randomly assigned to providers. So this was really useful because it allowed us to come up with very credible estimates of the relative impact of provider allocation. So we could see which providers were more effective than others. And across all the CPAs in the country, there were 26 possible comparisons, so 26 different impact estimates. And what we tried to do was to first of all demonstrate that effectiveness, and then to try and relate it to differences in the nature of the support offered, and to really try and understand what it is that drives that drives effectiveness. And the kind of bottom line on this is that it does matter. So which provider you get does matter, and this is illustrated in this chart, which relates to 5 different outcomes, and it shows a different impact estimate for each of the within CPA comparisons. So each of these is an estimate of relative impact. The red dot is the impact, and the kind of wings on either side of that are indicators of the confidence intervals. And what you see in this is that they vary quite substantially, and they differ often significantly from 0 across a range of these different outcomes. So this is very compelling evidence that the provider you get is important. This is based on 1.6 million randomized individuals, so it's a substantial data claim. But then when we tried to relate it to differences in the nature of the service, we found that most of the variation remained unexplained. So it's very hard to tell what the more effective ones are doing differently. And one interpretation of this that we kind of posit in the paper is that it provides some support against being too prescriptive regarding the actual elements of the service providers need to deliver, and some support, perhaps with the parameters of some minimum service provisions, some support for the black box approach. Okay, so the second program we evaluated was the Peterborough SIB Social Impact Bond, and this was providing support to prison leavers as a SIB, and the payment was dictated by the impact on reducing reoffending, meeting an agreed threshold. Now, since it relied on an impact, these impacts had to be estimated, and this was done by independent evaluators. And a lot of care was taken to ensure that this was done in a kind of fair and transparent way. But necessarily, there are analytical decisions involved in conducting that kind of analysis. And some sort of ex post work that we did showed that the results were quite sensitive to some of these decisions. So what that implies is that, what it could have implied in this case is that a different analytical choice could have flipped the payment outcome, and this would have been in an unforeseeable way. All this kind of combines to highlight the point that in this sort of setup that you have for the Peterborough SIB, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's one type of uncertainty that relates to whether or not the program itself is going to be effective. But there's another type of uncertainty that relates to whether or not the estimation is going to be able to faithfully capture that true impact. And of course, this uncertainty faces both investors and the people commissioning the program. So with this in mind, and this is my last slide, what does it suggest in terms of possible alternative ways of structuring the payment mechanism that could kind of embrace or reflect that risk? So to start with the Peterborough SIB, I mean, a kind of simplified version of the payment mechanism is this formula here, where P, the total payment, is essentially the product of the number of prisoners times the payment per prisoner, times this final more complicated looking term, which takes the value 1 if the estimated impact is big enough, and takes the value 0 if it's not. So this is a kind of all or nothing scenario. And there may be types of investors that this suits, more optimistic investors, or investors that perhaps have information that is not available to the commissioners, and are thereby in a better position to judge the likely impact. But it might suit everybody. And, so it's interesting to think about whether there are alternatives that kind of moderate that sort of scenario. And the one that we discussed in the paper is this one I've it was A1, which is the same as the SIB setup, except we replace that bracketed term with a probability. So this is now the total payment is now the number of prisoners times the payment per prisoner times the probability that the impact exceeds the threshold. Now, a probability is a number between 0 and 1. So this is definitely going to avoid it's highly likely to avoid a zero payout situation, and also highly likely to avoid the payout on the scale that's seen under the Peterborough SIB setup. There's something in between. And there are other adaptations to this which could be implemented to perhaps reward the extent to which the impacts exceed the threshold, with the aim of encouraging performance. We developed this idea a little bit more in the paper. But really, the point of saying all this is that, if you want to move towards something that takes this different approach, then there are implications for the evaluation. A standard evaluation is just going to give a point estimate of the impact, and there'll be some confidence interval around that. But alternative approaches, I've noted in here the possibility of Bayesian estimation or a Bayesian framework, allow for you to get an estimate of that probability term. And with that, there's more flexibility about how you can potentially structure some of these payment mechanisms.
Thank you.
And that's it.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was really, I think, a helpful follow-up to what we heard from Veronica, in the sense of you've got the drive for more robust evidence happening. And even in cases where we do see quasi-experimental methods applied to an impact bond, there's a pretty significant amount of uncertainty still, depending upon exactly the particular mechanisms of that evaluation and the use of particularly point estimation around that treatment effect being a payout. So I think helpful to sort of think about this as, if you are thinking about designing one of these impact bonds, what's the level of specification that you really need to think about, either as the commissioner or the contract authority, of what you expect your evaluation to do, and how are different stakeholders trading different sources of risk in the sort of under the guise of what the evaluation kind of does. So I think really very interesting to hear. That is all on this evaluation theme. So Alec, I will hand things over to you for Q&A, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. And thank you to Veronica and for both presentations there. So I'll do the same again, and brilliant. So Mathilde, you've raised your hand. Do you want to jump in and ask the first question, please?
Sure. Thank you, Alec, and thank you to our two presenters. I have a question for Richard. I was wondering if there is a space in the program's evaluations for studying the implications of social impact bonds beyond the time of the project. I mean, in terms of policy. For example, I think that the Peterborough social impact bond was then turned into a national program, which was supposed to integrate the learnings from the SIBs. And this was pretty controversial. I think the integration of this learning did not happen as expected. So if there is space in evaluation for wider studies about the implications.
Well, I think one thing that's interesting about the Peterborough SIB was, it was, I think the first SIB. So there was a lot of interest in actually learning from it, not just really understanding whether the program itself, the one service, was effective, but in understanding, whether this as a model was something viable. And one aspect of this was the evaluation. Now, it was commissioned by the Ministry of Justice, and there were two different evaluators, so that because there were two different cohorts that were assessed, and Jake and I were the evaluators on the final cohort, one that kind of determined the payment amounts. And having reached that position, the MOJ, you know, quite admirably, I think, were keen on understanding as much as they could about how what the relationship is between the evaluation aspect of the SIB and the program itself. And I think one of the things that, I mean, I mentioned different analytical choices could reverse the outcome. This was one of the things that we were commissioned to look at subsequent to this. And we did find that approach. So, I mean, I think that's, so we did find that outcome, that there were some questions around sample definition. They were kind of detailed questions, but they were important. And the way you approached them made the difference between whether that investment was repaid or not. I mean, it's not something that I think has got a huge amount of attention, but I think it's a very important finding. As to whether there's more that can be said about SIBs in general, I see it, I suppose, as just feeding into a larger body of evidence.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Mathilde, for the question. Now, Deborah, my colleague Deborah has her hand up. I thought she might in this session, so I'll pass over to Deborah for the next question. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, Deborah.
Hi. I know Richard too. I don't want to talk too much, but I actually have like a technical question and two more political questions. The technical question is, Richard, I was surprised by how diverse those 12-month outcomes were. And I was just, especially based on what I know on the literature, you know, from CARD and stuff, I was just wondering if you go a little further out to get to, obviously, to limit lock-in effects, do you have more overall positive results? That was a technical question. And then I have a general pragmatic question. Some of the stuff Veronica described about the burden of data collection and stuff is things that I've seen in my work a lot too. And I wonder if either of you have encountered issues with the government looking into administrative data linkages for comparison groups and for ease of data collection. And the last question on pragmatism is, I think probabilistic adjustments for impacts from my perspective are very interesting to Richard, but my research having also found randomness in outcomes and impact and subjectivity related to evaluation choices, as well as the first presenters finding that public officials don't understand statistics. How realistic do you think that is to really implement?
Thank you, Deborah. If we go to Richard first, then to answer perhaps the first and the third question, and then maybe to Veronica for the second question.
Okay, well, I can answer the first question quite quickly, which is, and I don't know. I mean, we didn't have that longer term data. So, I mean, that's just not something that featured in our evaluation. I mean, there is a very, I mean, this is for the work program, and there is a very kind of, definite temporal profile to the work program and people's involvement in it, which, you might expect to result in different impacts at different stages. So I think that there would be something interesting to look into, but it's not necessarily, certainly not something we've done. It's probably not something I'm going to do either. But the other thing is, I mean, in terms of a lock-in effect, I mean, some of the elements of the service that is provided by the work program wouldn't necessarily have a lock-in effect. I mean, you tend to think of lock-in effects as something, as arising with, training programs and things like that, where people kind of remove themselves from the labour market for the duration of their training. And this was a much more varied package of support or encouragement as well. And encouragement in DWP terms doesn't always have a lock-in component to it. On the the third of these, yeah, I mean, I'm glad to hear that sort of probabilistic approach is something of interest. I think it also has the the benefit that it provides a kind of formal way of incorporating existing knowledge as well, in a way that evaluation approaches don't. Yeah, I mean, of course, it's more complicated. And maybe that rules it out. But I don't know. I mean, it's one thing that was apparent in the evaluation of the Peterborough program was that there was an intermediary, social finance, and they were very willing to engage with the technicalities and the analytical decisions, very numerate. And now, of course, they're not the investors themselves, but they're, in a sense, kind of operate as the salesmen to the investors. So maybe there's, maybe that it's a similar argument to the fact that I use my mobile phone, but I don't know how it works. You don't necessarily have to understand the intricacies of the working, so long as you have a reputable and credible agent that's interpreting them on your behalf. Perhaps. I mean, that's pure speculation.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. That's an interesting way to think about it. And I did want to bring Veronica in to just respond to Deborah's second point around different stakeholder views, data access, and viewpoints on the evaluation. Veronica.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deborah and Alec. So, yeah, basically, in one case, we also see the governments trying to match data from different IT existing databases. I would say that it was not related to the use of control groups of experimental methods, but more the idea that the data were in different databases and they need basically to match them. Even in this case, basically they found some difficulties. In another case, this was the local authorities trying to use existing database. And in this case, I mean, they managed to design the process at the end, but of course there was some, I don't know, issues, for example, in terms of the privacy of the users that were not fully managed by them. So I would say that we found some attempt also to to shift from data collected from service provider to, of course, relieve the burden. But even in the use, of course, of existing database, they found some hurdles to in the design, let's say.
Brilliant. Thank you, Veronica. There's some really good points in the chat as well, which I might leave it to Richard and Veronica to perhaps have a scroll through once you're off the screen and maybe respond to any you'd like to. But I think that was 10 minutes, so I think we'll stop at this point, and I'll hand back over to Claire. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And I agree, some very interesting and excellent points being brought up in the chat, particularly around admin data, its limitations, and in particular, the sort of attitudes towards linkages to broader admin systems. So we've scheduled a bit of a catch your breath moment in this, because we know it's been a sort of quick session so far. So if we can take about 5 minutes, which will bring us back at like a minute after 4:40, which is a bit of an odd time to come back. But if we can aim for that, we'll try to get a head start on our next section of things to leave a bit more time for discussion at the end. So if we can see folks in 5 minutes and, get a cup of water, take a deep breath, and we'll see you shortly. I'll bring us back together in just about 5. Cool. I'll start inviting people to come back so we can kick off here in just a minute. So if you're with us, turn your camera on, or just let us know you're here. It'd be helpful. And Jesse, I think you're up to bat next. So if you can be ready with slides, if you're using them, that would be great.
Yes, I do have slides.
We'll give folks just a couple more seconds.
Stakeholders will have such different interests and different outcomes. So if it's more
Cool. Thanks, everybody. Hopefully you had a nice deep breath. We're going to kick back off again with presentations that sort of cluster around this notion of like SIB emergence in different contexts, in different policy areas, and some papers which compare perhaps on a policy level some of the differences we see across different impact bonds and other outcomes-based contracts that have arisen internationally. So with that, I'll pass things over to Jesse and his colleague, whose first name I don't know, but his last name is Das.
Excellent. Thank you, Claire. Are my slides showing up appropriately?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. So the work I'm going to be presenting today builds on previous work that I've done with John Loxley, and this includes material published in our book that recently came out through U of T Press, the University of Toronto Press, titled Social Service Private Gain, the Political Economy of Social Impact Bonds. What Anupam and myself are trying to do in this paper is more rigorously analyze the political, economic, institutional features of various countries and how they contribute to SIB adoption, as well as the scale of penetration of the SIB model. The goal is to assess which of these institutional features are the most conducive to facilitating SIBs. Now, SIBs have been rationalized as a contracting innovation that improves efficiency. It does this in theory by helping to resolve principal agent problems for government in the procurement of social services. And the ideal is that this will lead to a higher quality or more effective delivery of social services. This theoretical approach suggests that there would be universal appeal for SIBs. But what we see in the data is that SIBs have been adopted quite unevenly across high-income OECD countries. There's been a wide range of take-up, both in the number of projects, and what we suggest is a better metric, the amount of investment that's taking place in each of these countries in SIBs. Previously, this has been looked at from a welfare regime approach. And the suggestion here is that more liberal market economies are more likely to adopt the model. And this fits with various narratives of SIBs, including both from a critical perspective, which focuses on the balance of power between stakeholders, such as the financial sector and labor unions, or more simply just institutional complementarities in different countries. Now, recent data on SIB accumulation shows that the welfare regime approach captures an important part, but not the entire story. So we have liberal countries, including the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia, continuing to lead in SIB investment. But Finland, a social democratic country, has the fourth highest level of SIB investment. When we look at the 5th and 6th places, these are held by France and the Netherlands, which are in the three worlds approach corporatist countries. And then on the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, you have the more liberal country of Ireland that has no SIBs at all. So fundamentally, the welfare regime itself is incomplete. It doesn't give us a complete answer. And the approach is based on various indicators to begin with. So what we do in our analysis is go directly to those indicators and bypass this whole classification system. Now, earlier studies have put forward theories to explain why SIBs have proliferated in some countries and not others, or some contexts and not others. So Fraser, Tan, and Mays talk about beliefs, practices, and traditions, the existence of networks and trust. Alec and another paper with co-authors talks about conflicting values and ideological resistance. Rio in the French case talks about perceptions of the welfare state and social innovation. And Chiapello and Knoll talk about the importance of welfare regimes. So in our paper, we build on some previous work that looks at various institutional characteristics. So income inequality, worker protections and benefits, in-kind versus cash, social public expenditure, experience with privatization, and the size of the financial sector, the degree of austerity as factors that could contribute to a favorable environment for social impact bonds. In our paper, we're looking at, as our dependent variable, the scale of SIB investment, and our independent variables include the Gini coefficient as a measure of inequality, trade union density. We look at the percentage of social public expenditures and GDP as a measure of the size of the social welfare state. We look at the extent of private expenditures on social welfare as a proportion of total social welfare spending, degree of the financial sector as a part share of the economy, how aggressively austerity was pursued in the post-financial crisis era, and as well an indicator of institutional favorability to business. Finally, we include GDP per capita as a measure of income or development of the country. We use a two-part regression model. We couldn't use a standard linear regression model because many of the countries in our sample don't have any SIBs at all. And so we have a biased indicator that would come out of that process. And the two-part model accommodates those zeros and estimates the probability and occurrence of investment. So our results here, so you have a probit regression to determine which factors are associated with the SIB model, and then a linear regression to measure the extent of investment. So the results here are interesting. Some earlier predictions are verified. So high inequality is strongly associated with both the country adopting SIBs and higher investment levels. The degree of privatization intensity with respect to social expenditures is associated with the country adopting the SIB model, very significant, but only weakly significant with the level of investment. Some of the predictions of earlier studies are not clearly supported. So the bargaining power of labor is not clearly significant. It's only significant at the 10% level. The ease of doing business score, however, which in some ways can be considered the inverse of the bargaining power of labor, is weakly associated with SIB adoption at the 5% level for SIB investment. We have a strong association with the size of the welfare state. Financialization, again, not clear results, not significant in this specification. If we take out GDP, it does become significant. Most interestingly, we see some predictions of the earlier models being rejected pretty clearly. So austerity, for example, has the opposite intended sign on whether SIBs are adopted. A really intensive austerity regime actually is associated with not adopting the SIB model. So there's some implications here for public management when it comes to informing the decision-making process. These factors can be considered a degree of resistance that could be faced. And as we've heard, there's variations on the SIB model that can happen, and some of these could help accommodate difficult institutional circumstances. So just to wrap up my last slide here, the study supports the broad notion that political, economic, institutional characteristics mediate SIB adoption and provides a somewhat more rigorous contribution to assessing the impact of these relative institutional characteristics. And there's some support for many, but not all the earlier predictions. Great, thanks. So that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you for that. I think a helpful unpacking of some of the contextual factors that we've often heard talk about, perhaps the empirical case has not necessarily lended itself to the kind of analysis that you've presented here. So thank you for that. Next up, we've got Pelizari and Nunez.
Yes, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can you see my slide properly?
I can.
Great. So Fabian Muniesa and I would like to discuss our draft titled Social Impact Bonds and the Tactics of Feasibility. Experience from Chile, Colombia, and France. So we both are at the Center for the Sociology of Innovation in Paris. And this paper is focused on my PhD research, of which Fabian is a supervisor. So we collected qualitative data from 3 countries where SIBs are at different development stages. We have France, in which there are 10 SIBs now and more coming soon, mainly driven by a government-led initiative. We have Colombia, where a project from the Inter-American Development Bank called SIB School facilitated the development of a series of 3 SIBs and an outcomes fund, if you are familiar with that. And Chile, where no SIB, but a number of guidance materials have been developed within the government. We conducted more than 50 interviews and collected about 100 documents related to these cases. And we focus on one specific problem that we encountered many times throughout our fieldwork materials, namely the problem of feasibility. This does not mean that we are interested in how feasible and practicable SIB projects are. We are rather interested in feasibility as a category put forward by actors themselves, that is, as a vernacular category used by SIB practitioners in order to make sense of SIBs. So we show in the paper that SIB practitioners display minute attention to feasibility concerns, often proving more concerned by the how than by the what. Our theoretical approach draws from pragmatist sources, developing the concepts of tactics and trials. So on one side, we refer to tactics following Michel de Certeau's practice of everyday life, as making sense of situations in which schematization and ordering are difficult and require constant resignification. On the other side, we rely on the notion of trials taken from Boltanski and Thévenot and Bruno Latour, which are practical tests put to actions or claims in the process of becoming explicit. We contend that SIB practitioners develop tactics of feasibility that face such trials. And we identified 4 areas of delineation where the SIB arrangement was oriented and shaped by feasibility concerns. The one of legal structure, that is the commissioning methods, the partners, the legal frameworks used to write the contracts. The targets in terms of population and policy priorities. Impact, meaning the design of controllable and actionable metrics, cost-benefit analysis from a policy perspective. And to finish with financial value, covering the definition of the return on investment, the financial vehicles, asset management methods. And so our study shows that the devil is in the details. SIBs took different trajectories of implementation in Chile, Colombia, and France, and we explain this in light of situated trials and tactics of feasibility. And in particular, we suggest that there are 2 crucial elements in the implementation of SIBs. First, the way in which valuation is carried out, especially financial valuation, with a critical question of the level of return on investment. The focus on valuation operations provides a detailed picture of the financialization phenomenon that SIBs bring about. And second, the definition of handy metrics, which offers a perfect case for a sociology of quantification interested in quantitative bricolage. And metric feasibility informs to a very large extent the neoliberal policy reform narrative. That's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Mathilde. I think a fascinating sort of look at not what the process should look like for feasibility, but how do people actually think about that process and what constitutes something being feasible. And as ever, perhaps a sort of nod to the financialization ingredient of SIBs as it might play out in a particular context. So interesting thing to put against perhaps some of Jesse's conversation around the welfare regimes that may or may not be in place in a particular geography. So thank you for that. Next up, we've got French et al. I'm not actually sure who's presenting from y'all's end. Is it you?
That'd be me.
Over to you.
Great. Okay. Here we go. Great. Yeah, so similar to a number of papers, we're dealing with the SIBs and are they new public management or new public governance sort of question. The kind of take that we've got in this paper is that that's kind of a question that can only be answered over time, and that new public management and new public governments are as much sort of descriptions of a governance landscape as they are governance logics. So we associate NPM with like fragmentation, transactional principal agent relationships, and NPG is a move towards trust-based governance, collaborative governance, and user orientation. But what we're asking is, so there's a lot of literature saying that SIBs embody one, the other, or a blend of those logics, but not much over what logics they enact over time, and what sort of future public service landscapes is the increasing adoption of SIBs likely to lead to. So we take a longitudinal analysis of a fairly large scale UK well-established SIB dealing with social prescribing and administering a social prescribing intervention. And a question for the room is, we're not aware of any others taking an explicitly longitudinal qualitative analysis of that, but we're really interested. I know the first presentation was doing something similar, so it'd be interesting if I could link to that somehow. Yeah, and over development to stable implementation, getting outcomes-based payments by the end of it. So this was sort of a journey, and what we were asking is, how do NPG and NPM elements interact over time? These are the ones that we focus on, drawing from Osborne's interpretation. What sort of, does it entrench NPM? Does that become the more dominant logic? Does it transition towards NPG, which is kind of what Osborne predicted would happen in the governance landscape? Or does it end in a sort of blend or a hybridization of the two? So what we find broadly is the former, that what we argue in this paper is that in this case, NPM became entrenched while NPG was squeezed out. We found throughout NPG and NPM logics associated with particular individuals, NPM mostly with the investors and the SPV board, so people with power, NPG by the providers for their reason for engaging, and the SPV management. So we found coexistence, but how those logics interacted over time changed quite dramatically. So we found key decisions like the decision to appoint 4 providers for the social intervention as opposed to 1 or doing it themselves. We found 2 distinct interpretations of that decision. One was, hey, they're in competition and we can see which one's best and go with them. The other was, well, that gives us a great way to explore the complementarities between 4 different models and learn together over time. So as loads of people predict, I've said before, NPG and NPM very much present at the start and complementary as well. So we're entering into a contract to formalize our partnership into a long-term innovative kind of body that's going to, grow to scale and change the sort of partnership dynamics. By year 2, 3, we found those logics really in tension, and the investors were pushing hard for performance management when the performance information system became really well developed, and they could see who's underperforming, who's not. And we found NPG actually becoming quite a significant factor in that point, but in opposition to NPM. So we want to protect our spaces together to kind of collaborate and innovate. And we understand the increasing drive to performance manage provider behavior as kind of threatening that. And then by the end of it, when the SIB was being paid based on its outcomes rather than process measures as it was growing to scale, NPG elements had been subdued or completely excluded. So the opportunities for collaboration had completely diminished. Two providers dropped out, and it was seen as a good thing rather than a negative, as it would be from an MPG perspective. And really the NPM logics really being the kind of dominant frame. So what this leads to, of course, is that, like, well, do we understand SIBs as a kind of new public management reform? And I think one of the things is that, well, we've got what we did in the paper was looked at sort of what's driving that through our thematic coding approach. And we found two elements. One is power asymmetry. So the people with the new public management frame were able to enforce their views and their management approach more strongly. And particularly as the performance information system developed, they were able to do that more quickly. And then the second thing was that the drive and the hunger for data to get people paid was the kind of dominant frame throughout. So I suppose what our implications are, the SIB model, we argue, and elements fairly fundamental to that, investors and data, kind of drew, in this case, towards a very strong NPM model. And then also for the governance literature, that hybrid institutional forms, quite in opposition to what Osborne kind of claimed. He thought that there was a sort of natural kind of materialistic move from public admin to new public management and then to new public governance. We find that NPM is quite a strong factor in those hybrid forms. But we've got this, I suppose, the obligatory single study disclaimer. There's a lot of variation in the SIB field. I think what strengthens our view that in the conclusion isn't, obviously this needs to be empirically verified in other contexts, in other functional sort of coalitions and such forth. But these aren't new factors. These are well rehearsed in the literature. So we have that kind of theoretical generalization that we're laying claim to here a little bit. And the other thing is, I don't mean to be too much of a downer. Obviously there's a broad critical literature, but I think what we're trying to do here is say, well, in what ways would the SIB model need to evolve? I think our conclusion on that is that would it still be called the SIB? Yeah, so that's me. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks for that. And actually, Christy Economy wasn't able to present, but she asks a sort of similar question of like, how far do you stretch a SIB until it isn't really a SIB anymore? And I think helpful to have the pairing almost between what you've presented here and the first paper of Fox et al. In terms of the variation of how NPME or NPGE, an impact bond, is kind of changing over time, and helping understand that that's a sort of outgrowth of some of the negotiations between partners on a project that have very different amounts of power and basis of power in that relationship. So thank you for that. Last up, we will actually pass over to, I think Alec is kind of talking through the paper that he and Lisa have been working on, and then we'll do a bit of a transition for the session. So Alec, over to you, and then we'll move to the sort of discussion and next phase.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a paper which I've been working on with Lisa Knoll from Paderborn. We've not got some slides. I'm just going to kind of talk you through it over the next few minutes. So the piece of work which we're submitting for the special issue, hopefully, comes from a larger project led by Deborah Heavenstone, who you saw earlier, from the Bern University of Applied Sciences. We've been working on a 2-year project funded by the Swiss Network for International Studies, which ran from 2018 to 2020. The key question behind the overall project was really to look at the effectiveness of social impact bonds, particularly as applied to active labour market programs. There's 3 outputs from the paper. From the project, sorry. The first paper is this kind of SIB effect paper, which draws on mixed methods to try and answer this question about the effectiveness of the SIB model. The second paper looks at contracts and biases within contracts. And the paper that I'm presenting today is the third paper, which is a purely qualitative paper, which compares our different SIBs in our different countries. So in terms of methods then, it's a qualitative, comparative approach. We looked at 5 SIBs across 4 different countries. So we had 2 cases in the Netherlands, 1 in the UK, 1 in Germany, and 1 in Switzerland. We were really quite lucky in that we've got data on the first ever Swiss, German, and Dutch SIBs. So the data we collected is really quite interesting from that standpoint alone, in terms of how you bring this idea to a kind of virgin territory, if you like. In terms of methods, we did 5 kind of detailed case studies where we visited the sites and did interviews. We've done about 42 or 43 interviews overall, and we've also included some documentary review. In terms of theory, the theoretical angle we've tried to develop in this paper builds on Lisa's, some of Lisa's previous work. So there's a paper from Chiapello and Lisa Knoll from 2020, which was published in the Journal of Comparative Policy Analysis, which was another special issue which came out of this conference. So it's lovely to be back and building on that. And Lisa's paper really looks at 8 different welfare conventions. So we've got a civic welfare convention, a financial one, a philanthropic one, a market, entrepreneurial, behavioural, communitarian, and full employment welfare convention. And the paper encourages us to think when we're researching SIBs about the different ways in which SIBs are locally constructed by actors who exist within existing welfare conventions, who are critical of certain conventions, maybe want to move to other approaches, and really stresses the variability and difference between different social impact bonds. So what are our findings? So it's the first paper to apply the WCA approach to some empirical data, which hopefully is quite useful. What we find is in 2 of our 5 sites, there's a kind of prioritization of the civic welfare convention. And this leads to the SIB idea kind of struggling to take hold in that setting. There's a real risk to investor money, which makes it unattractive for investors. In 2 sites, we see the opposite in a way. We see a kind of prioritization of the financial welfare convention and what we interpret as overpayment to investors without real risk. The 5th site is different, and we see more of a kind of communitarian model, but it's a very low risk, and it's questionable whether it actually is a SIB at all. In terms of the broader implications, we find more evidence to back up Nayland's idea around the SIB being a kind of anti-market device. We don't see much evidence for the market welfare convention. We see much stronger evidence around the entrepreneurial welfare convention with some serious governance implications, we think. Again, we see very little around philanthropy, but essentially I think where we spent a lot of time in the analysis kind of trying to understand what was going on is this real tension between the civic welfare convention and the financial welfare convention, and how they play out against each other seems significant in the eventual constellation of a SIB, which we find in each local site. And I'll stop there because I think that's 5 minutes.
Excellent. Yeah, you had 15 bonus seconds, but either way. So thank you for that. I think a helpful sort of loop there in terms of the local context as sort of predicating the emergence of SIBs in a particular area. I'll give Alec a quick breather because I know we've got a couple of questions in the chat. So can I ask, there's a question for Jesse around how feasible disaggregation is at the regional level, sort of to pick up more heterogeneity in welfare regimes and increase observations. And then after that, a question for Max about the degree with which a public commissioner played a role in influencing that NPG and NPM shift. So can I take those 2 questions? And if there's still time, I'll pass it back over to Alec before we break.
Thanks for the question, Francesco. The question is a really good question. I think the challenge we'd run into would be are we comparing like with like? Particularly when we're looking at federalized systems compared to centralized governmental systems. Within a single country, you can argue that the indigeneity is relatively cohesive, but once we move down to the provincial, state, or regional level, that's going to vary from country to country. So the interpretation of the variables then and the estimated coefficients would be subject to some question. We do want to think about ways as to how to increase our sample size, because with our set, we're including high income World Bank countries that are OECD members for primarily for data purposes, as well as having a cohesive or comparable group. We have thought about going to a time series approach, and then we could look at things like the political ideology of governments in power, which I think has some promise as an explanatory variable as well. But many complications arise. Thanks for the question.
Thanks for that. Max, can I come to you and picking up the commissioner question?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Yeah, hi, Ruth. In terms of the public commissioner, it was a bit of both. So their views were very much in line with NPG and some of their actions as well. So the commissioner was responsible for or took some responsibility for setting up access to primary care. So they worked in partnership in addition to their role as a service commissioner or a contract manager. However, I think some of this was the first time that they worked with an outcomes-based contract, and their data management capacities and skills kind of got in the way and landed the SIB and everyone in it with maybe a lot more work. So that kind of data load squeezed out a lot of the flexibility and made the SIB more focused on data than it perhaps would have been otherwise. So I think it's a little bit of both.
Thanks for that. I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking that for time, what we will do is sort of stop some of the plenary discussion that we have been having to allow some of our authors here to move into smaller group discussions with guest editors. So I want to thank everybody for presenting your work today. It was a fascinating session and it was great to sort of get so many different ideas and themes out on the table. So thank you, and thank you audience members for joining us. So if we go back to that agenda, if I can ask non-author audience members now to go ahead and sign out of the room. The rest of the material for today's conversation is going to be sort of salient only for folks who have papers currently in sort of review for the special issue. So saying goodbye to folks who are not one of those authors, but thank you for joining us. Shoot us an email if you've got questions about future special issues or anything like that. But for now, we'll say adios to non-authors. We'll give it a beat so folks can sort of head out as needed. And now, my job is now to go through what we are all going to expect in terms of some of the submission deadlines we're trying to hit over the next few weeks. And then we'll sort of move into some of those smaller group discussions as I talked about. You'll be paired in your theme with the guest editors who've sort of begun reviewing your papers. Some folks I think have already gotten comments. Others, if you've not, you can expect comments soon. So what are the next steps in the submission process? Manuscripts are due in 30th of September, and they should be submitted via the normal IPMJ submission portal. That link to that portal you can find in the email from this event, I think if you go back, but it's also on the IPMJ website. So you're not sending materials to us as guest editors anymore, you're submitting them directly to the journal on the 30th of September. All your papers are going to go through a blind peer review. So this means you will receive another batch of comments on your draft, even if you're not ultimately selected for publication. So we'll be sending those out for blind review as soon as you get them to us. The 30th of September is the deadline. You're welcome to send your papers early if you want. I mentioned submitted papers are going through blind review. So that's kind of the technical submission sort of next steps. I will pause there and see if anybody has questions on that. You can always shoot me an email or Alec an email as needed. Okay, it looks like I've been very clear. So a couple of high level comments then on some of the drafts that I'll save my colleagues from having to repeat in your small groups. Some of the word counts are coming in a bit long, understandable given this stage in the drafting, and also understandable. IPMJ doesn't necessarily spell out word count limits directly that I can see on the website. So this is just a flag. It'd be great if we can bring those down closer to about 9,000 words, including references. A lot of folks are sitting upwards of 10,000, some as high as 14. So if we can sort of begin editing out some of the fluff, that would be great. Also wanted to flag that it'd be great if folks can really take time to meaningfully link the paper to the aims and scope of IPMJ. There's a lot of conversation happening in these papers amongst each other and amongst sort of the headlines for the journal themselves. So it'd be great if those can be really underscored. So do take the time to look through the sort of IPMJ website as well as some of the previous papers so that we've got that nice conversation happening with the journal itself. I'll pause again and see, Alec, have I said everything I should have said? I'm seeing a nod.
Yeah.
Cool. I'll also pause to see if anybody's got questions about that submission process or indeed about some of the headline comments I just provided. No, cool. Okay, so that is the last time we are all going to be in plenary now. We're going to break out into small groups. There should be at least one guest editor with you and some of the authors that you sort of presented alongside. That should happen automatically through the power of the internet. So let's hope it goes smoothly. If you run into issues or you don't end up in a sort of room that you expect to be in, I think if you just shoot a message on the chat, we should be able to sort that out and find you. So with that, thank you for coming. It's been a real pleasure to host this. We'll all sort of move into our rooms now. Thanks.